talked about injury prevention more broadly, and the groups working to advance some of the prevention efforts, let's now discuss preventative training programs more specifically and some of the benefits associated with preventative training programs. The preventative training programs that we'll be discussing are programs that last roughly 10 to 15 minutes in length and can be utilized as a pre-participation dynamic warm-up. So the preventative training program would be used in place of a team's normal warm-up. I do recognize that other programs might be longer in length. Sometimes they're really more attached to a strength and conditioning session, and they may be closer to 45 minutes to an hour, but we're really going to focus on that warm-up format. And the exercises that are typically included would address flexibility, balance, agility, plyometrics, core strength, and it would also include some sport-specific movements. Also, one of the main keys to a preventative training program is that there's an emphasis on feedback and cueing. So this really ensures that the exercises are being performed as they are meant to be done so that the athletes are truly improving neuromuscular control. Here's an example of how you might set up a preventative training program. This is a schematic of a basketball court, but you could make adjustments for a soccer field or any other type of sport parameters you may be working with. So here, from the yellow X's to the red X's would be approximately 10 yards. During this distance, the athletes would perform the dynamic exercise. So here, the athlete's just doing some forward lunges. And you'll notice this is on a field hockey field, so certainly any kind of adjustments can be made. And then here's another example. So in this instance, you may want to promote strength and movement quality. So you might want your athletes to perform some kind of stationary exercise. In this case, it's going to be the double leg squat. So in order to maintain the format and keep the athlete movement pretty consistent, one solution would be to tag a dynamic exercise after the squats in order to progress the athlete from baseline to the first set of cones. So here we're going to see the athlete performing double leg squats and then high skips to get to the next cones. So the athlete performs the dynamic exercise for the 10 yards, and then for another 10 to 15 yards or so, the athlete would perform a progressive jog. So that'd be from these red cones to the blue X's. And by this, I mean that the jog gets progressively faster with each exercise that is performed in the warm-up progression. So the first exercise should be quite slow, and then by the last exercise of the warm-up, the athlete should be full sprinting, and it should really be preparing them to jump right into activity. And lastly, from the blue X's back to the start is a recovery jog. So regardless of what part of the warm-up that the athlete is in, whether it's in the beginning or at the end, there's always a slow jog back to the start. And from there, the process is just repeated for each of the exercises that you've assigned to this team. And does this work? So the evidence around this area of research is quite positive. And here I've listed just a few key articles that were specific to youth athletes and reducing injury rates. So when we look at the impact of coach-led preventative training programs, there's a 50 to 75% reduction in lower extremity injuries. So this is significant because it means that it's not necessary for the athletic trainer specifically to run these programs every single day. Coaches can be taught how to lead the programs, or as we will discuss later, athletes can be instructed on how to run the programs, and there are still positive benefits. When we look more broadly at injury risk rather than just injury rates, there are different studies that have looked at specific movement patterns that are associated with increased risk of sustaining a non-contact lower extremity injury, such as dynamic knee valgus, as well as hamstrings to quadriceps strength ratios. So preventative training programs have been able to improve these factors to reduce injury risk for their athletes. Additionally, when we look more globally at movement, such as during a jump landing task or for a balance task, preventative training programs implemented over the course of a single sports season are able to elicit technique improvements and thereby reduce injury risk for these athletes. And there's evidence that shows that without specific training, movement technique does not change over the course of an athletic season. However, I should say that recent studies suggest that it may be more beneficial to evaluate movement technique and injury risk measures serially throughout the season to get more acute snapshots of injury risk with respect to training load. So just a side note. Lastly, when we consider a common sport-related motivator, performance, we find benefits with preventative training programs. Both of the studies mentioned here were specific to a youth population, but in one case they found vertical jump height improvements after implementing the preventative training program over the course of a season. And in the second case, a common complaint of coaches is that preventative training programs make their athletes too tired to engage in sport, so they perceive the warm-ups to be ineffective. This study evaluated the acute effects of 3 different warm-up conditions on sport performance, specifically a shuttle run, a long jump task, and vertical jump height, and the warm-up conditions were a static warm-up, a dynamic warm-up, and a preventative training program format, and the warm-ups were the same duration, and athletes performed the task before and after the warm-up. So this study found that the preventative training program was as effective as the dynamic warm-up on preparing the athlete for the performance measures. So the preventative training program was not detrimental and did not harm physical performance following warm-up. However, positive outcomes associated with preventative training programs are really contingent on the level of compliance with the programs. So athletes get more benefit when exercises are performed correctly, exercises are performed often. A study by Padua et al. Found that athletes who performed a preventative training program for longer were able to retain movement technique improvements compared to a shorter duration program. So this is important because it indicates that there's a need for long-term maintenance strategies to ensure that not only are the programs implemented on a day-to-day basis, but also on a season-to-season basis. And unfortunately, roughly 20% of coaches implement preventative training programs. This is alarming because we know that there are possible benefits for injury reduction as well as improvement, or at least doing no harm, to sport performance, and we know that lower extremity injury can lead to both short-term and long-term financial and social costs, so we need to be utilizing these strategies. And in order to promote adoption and maintenance of these programs, it's vital that clinicians find what works best for their given context. The needs and schedules of a secondary school football team will be very different from the needs and schedules of a professional team, which will be very different for men's compared to women's teams, we will review a framework next to help organize a preventative training program implementation effort regardless of setting or your population.